Okay, well, welcome everyone to In the Company of Stewards. We are again so happy that you're here. It's always fun to meet with other people and see faces, sort of in real life, from all over the country. I have a few announcements before we get started. So one, LDS or Stewardship is starting a podcast soon. And we are looking for hosts. So if you are interested or if you know anyone that might be a good fit, let us know. I'll put a link. I'll put some information in the chat. But we're excited about that, and we're hoping to get it going within the next couple months. So spread the word if you know any potential podcast hosts. Um, our second announcement is that we are going to have our fall forum on September 13th in Orem, Utah. If any of you were able to attend last year or watched it online, we had our first art exhibit last year that was like associated with it. And we'll be doing that again this year. So I'll put the info about that as well. But if you know any artists that may be interested in submitting their work, or if you are in Orem or nearby and would like to come on September 13th, we of course would love to see you there as well. Um, and then the third thing, there's a lot today. We have had some interest in starting a Southern California chapter, and I thought I'd bring it up here today because we'll be talking a little bit about Southern California. So if anyone here is a Southern California local or again knows someone that might be interested, I will also send the information about that. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. This is Kerry Anderson. Um, Kerry and I go way back, actually. When I was just a young preteen, I am friends with her daughter, and I had many sleepovers at her house. And then fast forward, like I guess 15 or so years later, we became colleagues at BYU, Idaho. So me and Carrie are both adjunct instructors at BYU, Idaho still, actually, for BYU, Idaho online, I should say. Neither one of us live in Idaho. And we teach a class on natural hazards. So I thought talking about natural hazards and natural disasters would be an interesting topic, but I wanted to outsource to someone other than myself, and I knew Carrie would be awesome. So let me introduce her a little bit. Um, Kerry Anderson lives in Thousand Oaks, California, which is in Southern California, and she is a meteorologist. Carrie, you can tell me if I'm remembering this correctly, but I believe she was on the news as the weather person in Buffalo, New York. Is that
Um, well, I did do Buffalo, Rochester, Salt Lake, and Syracuse, actually.
okay? So lots of places.
Yeah.
Um, And then she moved to Southern California, and she has a master's degree, correct, in meteorology. She currently teaches at BYU, Idaho, as well as American Public University, and she is also a wind forecaster. So, in addition to her academic expertise about weather, Carrie is also a Southern California resident that has had personal experience with wildfires and evacuating and all the chaos that causes. So I thought she was a great person to talk about both, the science of what's going on and her personal experience with them. So without further ado, Carrie, I'll hand it over to you and we will learn about wildfires.
Sounds good. Okay, so I didn't know you'd do that introduction, so I had actually
Oh, sorry.
started with no, 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 we're all good. Okay, why is my slideshow not going? Here we go. So what I was going to start with was telling you who I am not.
Okay.
As it turns out, there is a Kerry Anderson who is a PhD in fire weather. And so all the time I'm getting requests to say, are you the person who published this? And I'm very good. I do not say that I'm that person. And as you can see, I do not have a beard. So, but actually some of his research we're going to talk about. So Carrie is kind of an unusual name, but Chloe kind of told you a little bit about me. One of the things that I would say also is that I was raised in Australia and I'm actually British. Then we went to Australia, then Scotland, and then back to Australia, and then to the United States. And so when I started at KSL and started to work, wanted to work my way on the air, my news director told me, he said, you look fine, you know what you're talking about, but he said, no one knows what the weather is at the end of you speaking because you've got such a strange accent that they're just trying to figure out where it's from. So I jokingly say that your tithing dollars paid for my voice because they sent me to voice lessons. And so that's where my voice came from. So I do work as a meteorologist forecasting winds for windsurfers and kite surfers. And everybody else is really kind of cool. And, they're all out windsurfers. And so they asked for a picture for me to put on my blog post, and that's what they got, was me in my little kayak, because that's about as exciting as I am. And then there's my little family there. They're not so little anymore. That's about half of them. I've got 5 children. They're all married, and they've got 15 grandkids between them. So that's where my life is mostly spent. But what I wanted to kind of tell you about is my own experience with fire. So the first time I really remember being concerned about a fire was when I came home from first grade and we lived in Australia. We lived right on the edge of the bush, and the bush behind our home was on fire. And this is the back in the days before cell phones, before, mom wasn't home. We just came home to the house and mom would come home at some point, and there's the back of the house, not the actual house, but the fence was on fire. And I remember trying to figure out where I should go. And fortunately, back in those days, you knew all the neighbors, and somebody took me in, and the firemen came and they put it out, and we were all fine from that. But it's been interesting when we moved to Southern California. I remember being really nervous to move where there would be earthquakes. But actually, earthquakes haven't been what's been the concern. Fire. Fire is just part of our life here. So since I could ask Chloe this question here, but we won't, but our class that we teach is natural hazards and disasters. And I wanted to start out by talking about the difference between a hazard and a disaster, because I think as stewards of the earth, it kind of helps us start to look and consider, is it something that we're doing that is causing these hazards to become disasters? So the hazard is a fire. In our class, we're talking about natural elements. So it could be a tornado, it could be a storm, hurricane, snow, anything like that, that is hazardous to us. Now, if we prepare, if it's not too strong, if it's not too cold, whatever it is, it wouldn't be a disaster. But if that hazard then overtakes an area and causes so much damage that it overwhelms the resources of the community, we call it then a disaster. And what we're finding with wildfires is that they have gone from being a natural hazard that causes damage to becoming overwhelming disasters and really affecting communities. So, as I said, California, I thought this was cute when I saw it. This is true. I had not realized how true it is. So California has 4 seasons: earthquake, fire, flood, and drought. The 2 that I would say that I've had most experience here are fire and drought. Also some flooding, because in between the droughts, it's deluge. And in the 30 years that I've lived here, I've never hid underneath the table. But of course, that may change. Fire, though, really is a seasonal thing here that you expect. Once it turns fall, you expect to start seeing fires. We're kind of news junkies here, so the TV runs constantly, watching to see where the fires are, what damage it's causing, and if we need to evacuate. I have been evacuated a couple of times in the 30 years. More recently, not in the first 30 years, but in the last 10 years, it's been more common. I've now had two friends that have completely lost their homes in the Camarillo fire that happened um, in November. That was the mountain fire. That burned 19,000 acres, almost 20,000 acres. A large fire would be considered over 1,000 acres. And these are the five fires that took place since last November in the area that caused major damage. So in the Camarillo fire, that in one ward, there were about six. We went down in that area and we were doing a concert. And the people there had all sorts of stories of people who had lost their homes.
Hey,
So
Carrie, you froze for just a second. I don't know if it was just me or anyone else. Can you repeat that? I heard you saying at Camarillo about how many people lost their homes, but I didn't hear how many.
it was in one ward, there were about six homes that were lost. In the Palisades, I don't know what the number is, but it was substantial. So, so
Okay.
these, so we start seeing fire season in about October. And it usually runs into about December, and then January wanes. This year was different. This year was really crazy. We started with the mountain fire in November, the Franklin fire, which was down towards what we call the Pacific Coast Highway. That was 4,000 acres. And then we had the Palisades fire and also the Eaton fire at the same time. And those both burned into metropolitan areas. Those are the big ones in January that you probably heard about. And we could see it right from the temple there. And then another fire up, the Hughes fire was further north. It had a lot of acreage to it, but was not in a metropolitan area. But let me just show you a little bit of some of the data on here. I need to move all your faces out of the way so I can see what I'm talking about. Um, so you can see the dates. One of the things that's really interesting is just how long these fires burn for. That Eaton fire, it was burning for 24 days. But the number of structures, these are the numbers of structures that are lost and not the ones that are damaged, which is on top of this. So the Eaton fire that came through the Pasadena area, so that's where you see the Rose Bowl and the Rose Parade, that's all in that area there. They had over 9,500 structures lost. And it wasn't just single family homes. We're talking about stores and so through these fires, there was a lot of blame. I don't know if many of you saw this on the news, but there was a lot of blame put on the firefighters that they didn't do their job. There was blame put on the city that they ran out of water and they needed to prepare for this in advance. Um, it's really easy to blame other people, but there were factors in these fires that we're seeing more frequently that really show that we are moving into a time where these have become conflagrations. They're just so large that they really are uncontrollable. And probably one of the things we talk about in the natural hazards class is how do we mitigate? And that's a hard question to answer at this. So this is looking, just so you can take a look. So literally at this, in January, when these fires were happening, this is looking at the mountains going down toward the ocean. And you can see in the Los Angeles area, we have mountains on all sides of us. And that's one of the contributing factors to why we're getting such strong winds and such large fires. Um, this was the view as I was trying to make my way to the airport. My father had passed away in Australia. I was trying to make it to the funeral, and I had to go up one freeway going the wrong direction to come down another direction. Halfway to the airport, I'm like, honey, I can't leave and go. This was as the crow flies, maybe 10 miles from my home. And then this is driving down towards the temple and looking over to the west side of the valley there. It was it was bad. Interestingly, where we lived, even though the fires were this large, our air quality was just fine because the winds, you can see that the smoke is going all in the same direction. And this is because all of this was being fueled by winds. And it was blowing, if the winds are blowing away from you, um, basically you're fine. Um, and the air quality be fine. Now on the other side of there, that's a whole different story. So one of the things that was really interesting and crazy with this was I was watching the news as the Palisades fire started, and it started up a canyon. And the canyon, though, feeds right down into major metropolitan Malibu area. And as the news was broadcasting, they were seeing people running down the canyons, and they had left their cars in the middle of the road and taken off. And at first, there was lots of discussion of these people that they should have, stayed with their cars and they should have. The firestorm had come so quickly that they couldn't get through. And so then they had this compounded because now no one could get through on the roads because there are cars in the way. So in the afternoon, when this part of the firestorm passed through, they had to go up and bulldoze these cars just to get access through the area, something that I actually hadn't seen before. But it tells you of how quickly this firestorm passed through the area. And so you saw people in all phases of life that had, jumped in their cars, as they were sitting in their home. They weren't dressed, really appropriately, and they just fled and left everything behind to come back to find nothing in the area. So what I wanted to do, and Chloe, I see there's some questions. So is there anything that you saw that anyone
Um,
have?
so far, it's actually just me putting some in
Okay.
the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I wanted to do was kind of consider who do we blame for the fact that the number of large wildfires are increasing? So this is looking at data of fires over 1,000 acres going from like 1978 to 2017. And the trend line there shows that the number of large wildfires is increasing. And so the website that I pulled this from was from Climate Central. And you can see that they have a trend line there with the overall temperature over those time periods, which shows that it has gradually, the average temperature in the Western United States has increased. So the conclusion obviously there to draw would be the temperature is going up because of man-made influence, and we have climate change. And so therefore, more fires, much larger fires. And while temperatures are warming, and that does have impact on it, what I found in the researching that I did is that that is only a small part of the story. And what I found interesting, especially considering again the thought of us being stewards of this earth, was to kind of realize what parts we are playing in this in this spread of wildfire. Also, kind of interesting to consider with the prophecies that we have that in the last days there will be fire. And it made me stop and think, I kind of have always thought that that's something that's going to come down from heaven. And now I'm starting to realize as I get older that maybe we're the ones that do things that are going to cause these things to happen. And we seem to be doing it with fire. So one of the studies that I read, and this one I believe was out of British Columbia, and let me move everything off there, is that what they have found is that the amount of forest that has burned has increased tenfold, which is just amazing over the last half century. And that 2020 was the record at that point, but that I think it has actually increased since that time. So they come up with three major factors that are causing this. So one is historically high fuel loads. And the reason for this high fuel load is that we have our policy has been to suppress fire and outlawing indigenous burning. And so also we have less suppression tactics from so that we keep our firefighters' safety. And then also the increased aridity due to climate change. So it's interesting that climate change is a factor here, but the first two would really be more policy than climate driven. There we go. This is a picture from Australia and the Aborigines. It's interesting. When I was there a couple of times ago, we were up by the Great Barrier Reef, and we kept seeing in the hills smoke plumes. And as we were driving along, we found signs that said, "Don't call this in. We know this fire is happening." And that was because the Aborigines that own their tribal land in that area have a practice of burning, that they've lived there in this on this land for many, many years, and that they know what they need to burn and when to burn it. And so they make the choice to burn during times that it wouldn't be, we have weather that would allow wouldn't allow this to get out of control. And so it's one of the practices that we've stopped as we have taken over and built up in areas, is that we haven't burned the fuel loads, and the natural process is to have this fuel to be burned. So when a wildfire does start, it can become a very large fire. So that's something that we can change with policy.
Kerry, I have a question.
Yeah.
And this, you might recognize this question because this is kind of something similar to our class. But you mentioned, yeah, suppressing fires instead of letting them burn. How much of that has to do with population? Whereas, like before, it was a possibility to just let them burn, but
Right.
now if they let them burn, they're gonna affect people.
Exactly. That's we have moved into areas that would normally naturally burn. And not only have we moved into them, but we've moved into them and we want this natural look, which would be the trees hanging over and, nestled in this wonderful idyllic look. But really, that's not a sustainable practice, because when fire does come, your house burns down. So this I found absolutely fascinating. This was a look at in British Columbia, their trends looking over 100-year period. And if you look at the acres burned, even into the year 2010, it was going down. And then look how quickly that shoots up. And then the number of fires also had gone down and then shoots up. So if we're just going to look and put blame solely on climate change and global warming, you would not have expected to see this downward trend. And so what we see with this, huge jump this quickly tells us that there's other things other than just climate change that is causing such a large area to be burned. And one of those would be the fact that we've suppressed burning. So I found this from that paper. It said wildfire ignition and spread is determined primarily by day-to-day weather superimposed on broad climatic patterns. And then the final, it says making fingerprinting the specific effects of climate change on fire activity challenging. One of the things, if you want to see me just get like super irritated as a meteorologist, is whenever there's a big weather event where there's a disaster, tornado, floods, anything like that, you will see the reporter standing there. And if you've got a government official, many times they're like, and this just proves climate change is causing all these disasters. Well, that climate change and global warming is not simple, as it says here, because there are so many other effects that go into play to your day-to-day weather. So to take a day-to-day weather incident and blame it on global warming, there's a lot of numbers crunching and decisions to be able to do that. We've had large storms for many, many years. We've had fires for hundreds of years. So it's not appropriate to pinpoint every disaster to being weather disaster, to being on climate change. And so I think that as humans, we need to look at some of the other things that we're doing. So just quickly, one of the things about the fires here in Southern California is that they are mostly wind driven. What happens in the wintertime, as I mentioned, when we get to October, we expect to start seeing fires. And that's because on average, as the jet stream starts to dip, we start to see high pressure moving into the Great Basin. And when you have this high pressure system setting up, winds blow from high pressure to low pressure. So what happens is the winds come around clockwise around this high pressure system, and they blow from the desert up and over the mountains. And then as the air starts to sink and it gets to a lower elevation, it will be compressed. And as it's compressed, it will warm up and it will dry out, which are the two factors that you need for critical fire weather. So naturally, we are going to see wind-driven fires in Southern California. Now, I work for Weatherflow. Tempest is their company, and they have networks of wind sensors. And Southern California Edison has also now put up a bunch of sensors. This is one of their sensors from that Camarillo fire. And you can see from these are arrows showing where the wind has come from. And the wind there all day long was from the northeast. And you can see that it is gusting. We've got sustained winds up to 40 and gusts up to 60 miles an hour. These winds drove the flames of this fire about 2.5 miles from the source. And so because of that, the firefighters, they couldn't get there as fast as the embers could get there, and the flames started in the next location. And it's these blowing embers with the winds that cause such difficulties when these fires break out. So this is a look at the modeling that we do. And this is, again, the Southern California coastline. And you can see that the winds, they're kind of strong coming off of the desert, but you can see as they get funneled through the mountains. And one of the mountains that we hear about is the Santa Ana Mountains down by Orange County. And so the winds are traditionally called Santa Ana winds, but they're actually down here. And these winds were up here, up in Ventura County. And so this whole front range, depending on just the tilt of where the winds are coming from, will determine where it's most likely to have fire. So the criteria you need, what the National Weather Service looks for is that relative humidity of 15% or less, and winds 25 miles per hour or greater for 3 hours during a 24-hour period. That would put out a red flag warning. This last season, we had a PDS warning, a particularly damaging situation, because they saw that the winds were going to be so strong. And we had 4 of these events this past year. Now, why? There's nothing that we can pinpoint exactly. It could just be, one of the variations in the weather of that year, that the jet stream sunk a little bit lower, the high pressure came a little bit lower. But we had 3 of these events that were particularly damaging situations. So, and this is the Camarillo fire, looking at our friends that lived up in the hills. They said that her husband was gone, and he came home and was like, oh my gosh, the hillside's on fire. She was in the home, had no idea. And like I said, the ember had flown from they say 2.5 miles that ignited the hillside on fire. And once that started, you can see that this is the hillside, and then the winds are blowing this way you can see from the tree here. And so it blew down into the valley. Now, what was so hard is that many times you go, there's a fire, and they said that they had, I can't remember, 1,000 firefighters on this fire. And they lost, I think it was 400 structures. There was a town meeting afterwards. People were really pretty upset and angry that the firefighters hadn't been able to do anything. And one of the things they came out and talked about was just that when you have the winds blowing like this, you don't have one fire and one fire front. You have fire all over the place because it's hopping and skipping. So we drove through a couple of weeks after, and I was like, I don't see the fire. I don't get it. There's nothing here. And then suddenly there was like nothing in this one lot. The house next to it's fine. The house on the other side was fine. And this house was just burned down because it caught one of these embers. And so the firefighter said there was just no way they could protect all the structures because they're not just sitting in one area. They were getting calls all over. And so they said that they moved from an offensive to a defensive strategy, and they were able to save all the lives that they said they had 256 rescues. But unfortunately, we lost structures, but we didn't lose any humans. So the other thing that happens when the winds get this strong is that we are not able, let's see if I can get this to play. It's really kind of cool and amazing. Let's see. So one of the things that I have learned living here is that the firefighters actually make fairly decent money, and they live in nice communities, and they deserve every penny that they make. We could not live where we live without a fire department. And one of the things that protects us is the capability to fight from the sky. So this is a super scooper coming in over the ocean to pick up. Now, okay, if the wind was not blowing, what they're doing is super crazy, right? Now, once the wind starts blowing and it's really strong, this becomes something that you just can't do. And so when we have winds as strong as we had for these last 5 fires, the air support was called off. And so we no longer had that. And it was really interesting to see how quickly we got ourselves into some serious situations without that air coverage. So just another look at it without air support, we cannot live in Los Angeles, and we definitely cannot live as closely as we build to one another. That is the other key. The way we have built, with tight-knit communities nestled into the trees, there is no way that we can do this and without firefighting. But when the winds get this strong, you can't have the firefighters. And so then you move from this being a wildfire in the forest to being one that goes from house to house. I was talking to a firefighter, and he said, once it gets into a house, once it gets into a neighborhood, then you go from house to house really quickly. So one of the issues when the wind was blowing so strong is they said they would have a spray that would be going at 100 psi, and that the wind would blow it so that it wouldn't hit the target. And by the time it did hit anything, it was down to 40 psi. So they were not able to fight the fires because the winds were so strong. So not only did we not have air support, but we also didn't have the firefighters able to reach the fire with the water. So we heard of, the water going dry, but even without that, with the wind, the water wasn't able to put out the fire. They say that the fires were consuming houses in 2 to 3 minutes. and fight a fire takes much longer than that. So one of the case studies that I read about was the Fort McMurray fire, which was in Canada. And there one of the things that they ended up doing was they just went in and started bulldozing homes that were standing and just flattening them and letting all the cars and everything fall into the hole and into the basement because they could make a fire break at that point. Because water was not effective. None of the other firefighting activities were effective when it was so dry and so windy. So once you have wind, it becomes just a whole different animal. And because we have so much fuel, because we build, you can see, look at this home with trees hanging down close to the home. Uh, these fires become so hot. In fact, one of the things they said was that the plastic vinyl fences had caught on fire. Normally you'd think that, that's oh, I've got a plastic fence, it's not going to catch on fire. But the fires become so hot when they are going house to house and are wind driven that they are just incinerating cars, incinerating everything in their path. So another thing that is happening in Southern California is that we have a mustard plant that is non-native to the area, and that has started taking over. And this mustard plant dries in the fall, which is our fire season, and before it is burned or cut down, the seeds from it actually will propagate, and the plant is able to continue growing. And so this has become a real issue in our area. And another environmental concern is that we have this non-indigenous plant that is just making wildfires. It's great fuel for fires. And so if we can't burn it off, because as Chloe mentioned, we've got people living in the area, you get on Nextdoor and people are always complaining about having to cut it down and that they can't get it down. It's really hard to weed whack. And so that's another issue that we have. So as we look at who is to blame, I was talking to a firefighter while it was my grandson's carnival one day, and he was like, "Pfft." He said, we plot maps, we look, and what we find is that humans cause most of the ignitions. And so I went and looked up some data, and you can see that they say anywhere from 84 to 90% of all the wildfires are started by human activities. Smoking, campfires. I like the one of them is children. So blame our children on that one. Debris burning, arson. Now, here in Southern California, one of the biggest problems is our electrical lines. Our electrical lines are above the ground, and when the winds blow, they are blown down, and so they start fires. So they found that most of the fires are being caused, some of these really big fires have been caused by electrical lines sparking and coming down. So the wonderful thing that happens in Southern California now is that we have PSPSs, which is that they public safety power shutoffs. So every fall, we can count on that our power will be shut off when the wind starts to blow. Fortunately, they're dialing it in, and my little neighborhood is not as bad, but I have spent days with no electricity because Southern California Electricity is now being sued for these large wildfires, which are in the billions of dollars of damage. And so their solution is to shut off the power so that the power lines can't ignite the fires. And so when it's starting to get a little chilly, I know that compared to the rest of you north of Utah, that you don't think of us as getting chilly, but it is. And our power is out. So our freezer, everything in our freezer you have to have something so that it's not melting. We just had the sweetest couple that our children had moved out, so we converted part of our home into an apartment. And they came and moved in and started a job, and they lived here for like a year and a half, and then they moved out and got their apartment and planned to stay here. But after two falls of sitting without power, they were like, we're done. It wasn't earthquakes that made them leave. It was the fact that they're stuck without power. So they had a brand new baby and they're in the dark for days on end. And it happened for them where they were living right up next to the wilderness. They ended up having sitting in there for a couple of weeks. So SCE is coming up with, and the power companies in the West, of ways to help to reduce this. And it is getting better. Last year, my power only got shut off a couple of times. So that's better, but other people are off for weeks. So they're covering the wires, they're building fire resistant poles, they're trying to put wires underground. So they're making progress, but I can tell you it's really a pain to live through it. Okay, I'm realizing we're running out of time, Chloe. Do we need to stop? And
You have a hard stop at the
I
hour.
do. Let me wrap it up here, and then if you have some questions. So one of
Okay.
the main things is we're building our homes with materials that are flammable. We build with kiln dried lumber. So basically, we are putting a dried out tree in the middle of trees in this beautiful forest and wondering why it burns down at the end of the day. We're also building with materials that are very flammable. So this would be, this is beautiful, but is it going to save us during a fire? So you can go on websites and find out. There's many ways that you can build defensible space. And what we found is that homes that do that they can be saved. This was a home in the Palace, I think this is Palisades fire. I can't remember, but you can see all the other homes around it burned down. This is a passive home, passive solar home. And because of that, they tried to build it so that most of the air stays in the home. So you don't get air from the outside coming to the inside. And by doing that, they were able to save this home. You also see they have cement walls, not wood walls. They have vinyl in the back. They have metal railings around it. They don't have eaves. Many of the fires that are starting because embers are blowing long distances, and it isn't like large flames going from house to house, but it's actually, they say, groups of embers that start homes to ignite. I know of one person who, it was actually one of the teachers in our group. Remember, Chloe? That said that her brother was a firefighter and he saw their parents' house on the news and recognized that they were having smoke in the attic, and he got over there, was able to put out this smoldering fire and save the house. So one of the things you can do is to put mesh on all your vents that go into your attic, because that's one of the ways to protect. So this is ecologically, we'd look and say we're great stewards to plant something like that, but that is actually a fire hazard. All the wood mulch that we put down just is tiny little embers that can fly long distances. Our church was on fire, and the thing that the men were called out to do and that protected the structure was that they went up there and they were just pounding down all of these little spot fires that had developed where the wood chips were burning. So guess what they did just a few months ago? Put down more wood chips. Just saying. So I wanted to finish with this because I find it, so we started talking about hazards versus disasters. So in the course that we teach, one of the things that it teaches is that hazards are not increasing, but disasters are increasing. And we've kind of gone through in this presentation why fire disasters are increasing, and many of them are what we are doing. But I found this really fascinating. Elder Oaks, about it was I think 2010, said in general conference that the statistics would say that there are increases in some of these hazards. And he says that, I can move this, increases by comparison with 50 years ago can be dismissed as changes in reporting criteria, but the accelerating pattern of natural disasters in the last few decades is ominous. And so whether it's us causing it or I think that what I got from this talk is, one, I can listen to a prophet, and that as we come into real difficult times, that we can have warnings. But I also look and say, maybe one of those warnings is that we need to change some of our practices so that we are better stewards of this earth, rather than sitting back and go, "Ugh, the world's on fire, we're all going to die." That we can look and say, maybe there's some things that we can be doing to change our practices so that we can be better stewards.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was fascinating. I learned a lot, and I'm also a little glad that I live somewhere where that's not our major natural hazard that we worry about.
Okay,
Um,
so, but be careful in saying that, because
yeah, knock
Texas
on
is
wood.
actually, yes. One of the things that I have noted is that we're starting to see fires breaking out that are large fires in areas that aren't the traditional places. So.